Hello, and welcome back to our video series on pharmacology. In this video, we'll discuss chapter number 21, Anti-Infective Drugs. Learning objectives for this chapter: compare and contrast how different categories of antibiotic drugs kill bacteria, explain the significance of the beta-lactam ring and penicillinase, describe historical milestones in the development of penicillin, explain how various consumer, medical, and environmental factors produce antibiotic-resistant bacteria, compare and contrast how different categories of antiviral drugs act to treat HIV and AIDS. Describe the development of drugs used to treat HIV and AIDS. Describe the treatment of opportunistic infections associated with HIV and AIDS. Explain why fungal and yeast infections are often treated with the same drugs. When given the name of a well-known anti-infective generic drug, identify the trade name. When given the generic and trade names of an anti-infective drug, identify what drug category it belongs to and what disease it's used to treat. When given an anti-infective drug category, identify several generic and trade name drugs in that category. And lastly, when given an ending common to several generic drugs, identify the related drug category. Alright, we'll start off talking about sulfonamide anti-infective drugs. This is a group of drugs that inhibit bacterial growth. It's also known as bacteriostatic. And these are not categorized as an antibiotic drug because they don't kill bacteria. They just limit them from replicating, or they keep the numbers of bacterium at a static level. Some examples of sulfonamides would include folic acid. Now, folic acid will interfere with the growth of some bacteria that must manufacture their own folic acid. Now, human cells can utilize folic acid from sources outside their cell and are not affected by sulfonamide drugs. And folic acid drugs are effective against many gram-negative and gram-positive bacteria. And this is used to commonly treat otitis media in the ear, urinary tract infections, and meningitis. And these are also known as just sulfa drugs for short. Some examples of sulfa drugs would include sulfadiazine, or sulfasoxazole, which is known by its trade name of gantrinsin pediatric. And this drug is often combined with the generic drug trimethoprim to become the drug SMZ/TMP. And that combination is also known by its trade names of Bactrim and Septra. I mentioned a historical note. In 1934, a German researcher was screening chemicals for possible medicinal use. And during the process, a red dye used to color the cloth was tested, and it seemed to cure streptococcal infections in mice. This researcher's own daughter was dying at the time of streptococcal septicemia from pricking her finger. So in desperation, he injected her with this dye, and she recovered. The red dye was converted in the body into the anti-infective sulfa drug sulfonamide. And for this discovery, this researcher won the Nobel Prize. Now, until the introduction of penicillin, sulfa drugs were the only anti-infective drugs available to treat bacterial infections. Alright, now we'll talk about antibiotic drugs. And one kind we'll focus on here are the penicillin antibiotic drugs. Now, this is a group of drugs that will actually kill bacteria. And these share a common molecular structure of a beta-lactam ring. And how this class of drugs will work is they interfere with the cell wall that surrounds the bacterium. And this will disrupt the intracellular content, causing the cell death. Antibiotic won't affect human cells because human cells only have a cell membrane. We do not have a cell wall like bacterium do. Now, penicillin antibiotics are used to treat a wide variety of infections, including gram-positive infections, gram-negative infections, anaerobic bacterial infections, and sexually transmitted diseases. So this is known as a broad-spectrum antibiotic drug because they have the ability to kill a variety of different kinds of bacteria. Now, drugs in the penicillin category differ from each other in the following ways. Some are inactivated by gastric acid and can't be taken orally, such as the penicillin G drugs. Most of the drugs are inactivated by penicillinase, but there are some exceptions. Those exceptions include dicloxacillin, nafcillin, and oxacillin. And penicillinase is an enzyme that is produced by penicillin-resistant bacteria. This is also known as beta-lactamase because it inactivates penicillin by breaking their chemical structure at the site of the beta-lactam ring. Now, most drugs in the penicillin category have little antibiotic activity against gram-negative bacteria, and only exceptions here include piperacillin and ticarcillin. Some common examples of penicillin antibiotics: amoxicillin, known by the trade names Amoxil or Moxitag; ampicillin, known by its trade name of Principin; dicloxacillin, nafcillin, oxacillin; penicillin G potassium, also known by its trade names of Permapin and Pfizerpin; penicillin G procaine; penicillin V, also known by the trade names of penicillin VK and Vtids; and piperacillin. In this image, you'll see the chemical structures of common types of antibiotics, and you'll see here the beta-lactam ring which is a very common structure found in all penicillin category drugs. So another form that you'll find antibiotic drugs given are in combination drugs. And what you'll find here is a penicillin drug and also a substance that will inactivate penicillinase. And some examples of this would include clavulanate potassium or clavulanic acid, sulbactam, tazobactam. Some examples of these combination antibiotic drugs: augmentin, which is a combination of amoxicillin and clavulanate potassium; timentin, which is a combination of ticarcillin, clavulanic acid; unicin, which is a combination of ampicillin and sulbactam; zosyn, which is a combination of piperacillin and tazobactam. And now we'll talk a little bit more in depth about different types of bacteria. One kind of bacteria that you can have are aerobic bacteria. And this kind must have oxygen to live. And this can be in either a gram-positive or a gram-negative form. And the differences between those two is how they stain histologically. When they go through a gram staining process, ones that are gram-positive will retain the crystal violet stain and appear violet to a bluish color. The ones that do not retain the stain and remain a reddish, pinkish color are gram-negative. You can also have anaerobic bacteria, and these can live without oxygen. Now, a drug from any category of antibiotics that is able to kill a variety of different types of gram-negative, gram-positive, anaerobic bacteria is known as a broad-spectrum antibiotic, or an extended-spectrum antibiotic drug. Historical note about penicillin: in 1928, the Scottish bacteriologist Alexander Fleming was looking for drugs that would inhibit the growth of the bacterium Staphylococcus. He finished his experiments and then went on vacation, after instructing his assistant to wash the culture plates that were soaking in the sink. When he returned back from vacation, the plates had not been washed, and one culture plate had remained above the water, and on it had grown a blue-green mold with a ring around it where the Staphylococcus bacteria had been killed. Fleming identified this mold as Penicillium notatum. However, he was unable to extract a drug from this. The mold itself contained only 1 part penicillin per 2 million parts mold. He wrote a paper about this finding, but it remained generally unknown to the scientific world. Now, during World War II, work on penicillin resumed. 2 researchers in England were afraid all the drug would be destroyed in the bombing of London, so therefore they smuggled some of the mold inside their coat jackets and brought it to the United States, where penicillin could be produced. A 43-year-old policeman was the first person to be injected with penicillin. He was dying of septicemia, which began as an abscess from being scratched on his face by a rose thorn. And penicillin was in such short supply that his urine was saved each day, and the penicillin in it was extracted to provide the next day's dose. So he ended up receiving the entire world's supply of penicillin. And he responded well to the treatment, but on the 5th day, the supply of penicillin ran out, he relapsed, and eventually died. Because the mold Penicillium notatum only grew on the surface of a culture medium, it had to be produced in many shallow bottles, and the yield was very small. Later, researchers found the strain Penicillium chrysogenum on a moldy cantaloupe in Peoria, Illinois. It was approximately 20 times more potent than the original mold and could be grown in much larger quantities. When the U.S. entered World War II in December 1941, the government took immediate control of the supplies and production of penicillin, and advised the Committee on Medical Research to distribute the drug carefully for medical investigation. The first small amounts of commercially produced penicillin became available in 1942. By the end of that year, 100 patients had been treated with it. On Wednesday, July 26, 1943, the Pittsburgh Press ran an article entitled "Penicillin Drug Hailed as Boon to Mankind." The article noted that penicillin took its place alongside the sulfa drugs as a deadly enemy of infection and disease. And by 1945, penicillin had become a household word, and the word antibiotic was coined as well. Another type of antibiotic drug that we'll talk about are the cephalosporins. And this is another group of antibiotics that will end up killing bacteria. And the way they work is they interfere with the cell wall that surrounds the bacteria, which will cause a disruption with the intracellular contents and will lead to cell death. Now, cephalosporin drugs are divided into therapeutic antibiotic properties, and they're owned by first generation, second generation, and third generation drugs. The first generation cephalosporin drugs are a fairly broad spectrum of effectiveness against bacteria, but these are not effective against bacteria that produce penicillinase. And some examples of this type of first generation drug would include cefadroxil, cefazolin, and cephalexin, also known by its trade name of Keflex. The second generation cephalosporin drugs were more effective than first generation drugs against penicillinase. These are also effective against more gram-positive bacteria. And some examples of a second generation cephalosporin drug would be cefaclor, also known by the trade name Seclor, cefodotan, Foxetin, cefprozil, and cefurazime, known by its trade names of Ceftin and Zinacef. The third generation of cephalosporin drugs are the most effective against penicillin that produce penicillinase. And these show the greatest effectiveness against gram-negative and gram-positive bacteria. This generation can also pass through the blood-brain barrier, which is very useful for treating meningitis. But the cost of these drugs is a lot higher than those of the other generations of cephalosporin drugs. All right, some examples of a third-generation cephalosporin drug could be cefdinir, also known by its trade name of Omnicef, cefditorin, known by its trade name of Spectracef, cefepime, also known by its trade name of Maxipime, cefixime, known by its trade name of Suprax, and cefotaxime, known by its trade name of Clafuran. Other examples: cefodoxime, known by the trade name of Vantin, ceftazidime, known by the trade names of Septaz and Fortaz, ceftabutin, known by the trade name of Sedax, ceftazoxime, known by the trade name of Cefazox, and ceftriaxone, known by the brand name of Rocephin. Now, the fourth generation cephalosporin drugs are only effective against some gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria. An example of this kind of drug would be cefepime. And a fifth generation cephalosporin drug are only effective against some gram-positive bacteria. An example of this kind of drug would be ceftaroline, known by the trade name of Telflaro. Now, cephalosporin drugs and penicillin drugs are structurally very similar to each other, and patients who are allergic to penicillin drugs may have an allergic reaction to cephalosporin drugs. And now we'll mention a drug controversy about antibiotics. Most bacteria have developed resistant strains that are immune to certain antibiotic drugs. This has happened because antibiotic drugs have been so widely prescribed and are often prescribed for conditions that don't warrant antibiotic use. Many parents do not know that a viral infection can't be treated with an antibiotic drug, so they incorrectly pressure the doctor to prescribe an antibiotic drug, and sometimes the physician will give in to this pressure. A study conducted by the University of Tennessee found that pediatricians incorrectly prescribe antibiotic drugs 42% of the time. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, pediatricians will prescribe antibiotics more often if they perceive that parents expect their child to be given an antibiotic drug. The American Academy of Pediatrics guidelines state that educating parents is the single most important issue in reducing the overuse of antibiotic drugs. Many physicians now give parents pamphlets describing how antibiotic drugs are overused in order to convey the idea that just because they are not prescribing one doesn't mean they are receiving incomplete medical care. Also, antibiotic drugs are given to animals so that they can be housed in crowded conditions that would normally cause disease, and the meat from these animals contains traces of antibiotic drugs. The nonprofit Union of Concerned Scientists reported that 16 million pounds of antibiotic drugs were given to animals annually in the 1980s, and this increased to 25 million pounds in 2001. In addition to that, patients take about 3 million pounds of antibiotic drugs each year. In 2013, the CDC noted that 2% of Americans develop an infection from disease-resistant organisms, and 23,000 of them will die from those infections. They found that 25% of prescriptions for antibiotic drugs were for a disease that antibiotics could not treat. Another class of antibiotic drugs we'll talk about are the aminoglycoside antibiotic drugs. This is a group of drugs that will kill bacteria, and the way they do so is they interfere with the synthesis of proteins in the bacterial wall. So this will disrupt the intracellular contents and will cause the bacterium to die. These are primarily effective against gram-negative bacteria. Now, some of these types of drugs, such as kanamycin and neomycin, are not absorbed from the intestines into the blood. So these are given orally as a bowel prep to inhibit bacteria prior to abdominal surgery. And this class of drugs is used to treat a wide variety of gram-negative and some gram-positive bacterial infections. Some examples of this type of drug: amikacin, known by the trade name of Amikin; gentamicin; kanamycin, known by the trade name of Cantrex; neomycin; paromomycin, also known by the trade name of Humatin; streptomycin; and tobramycin, also known by the trade names of Toprex and Toby. Now, all aminoglycoside antibiotics have the potential to cause toxic effects to either the auditory nerve, known as ototoxicity, or to the kidneys, known as nephrotoxicity. Now, patients receiving aminoglycosides are carefully monitored with hearing tests and blood tests for kidney function, such as creatinine and BUN. When calcium is taken at the same time as the aminoglycoside antibiotic gentamicin, it can increase the chances of developing nephrotoxicity. Some antibiotic drugs and some antifungal drugs increase the blood-thinning effect of anticoagulant warfarin, also known by the name Coumadin. So this will increase the risk of bleeding by as much as 4 times. So how does a physician know what category of antibiotic to prescribe for each particular patient? The physician gives the patient a prescription for an antibiotic drug that seems appropriate for that patient's symptoms. So while the patient is still in the office, the physician will collect a specimen of the infected area and send it to a lab for a culture and sensitivity test. In the lab, the specimen, whether it be urine or blood or mucus, pus, saliva, and so on, is swabbed onto a petri dish. The dish is allowed to incubate and grow colonies of the bacterium. The results show the bacterial colonies, and these are used to identify what bacterium or different kinds of bacterium are causing the infection. The bacterium is then swabbed onto another petri dish, and specific concentrations of antibiotics are added, and then this petri dish is then incubated. The antibiotic drugs that are effective against that bacterium will have a very large zone of inhibition, another term for a clear ring, around their disc, where the bacterium was not able to grow. So the result of this lab test is sent to the physician. So the physician can then check to see if that preliminary antibiotic is the one that is most effective in treating that bacterium causing the patient's infection. If it's not the most effective, the physician will write a prescription for a different antibiotic drug. So now this image, we have examples of petri dishes being inoculated and then colonies are being grown. As you can see here, all these are individual colonies of bacterium. And then these white discs each have different concentrations of antibiotics on them. And the one that has the biggest clear ring around it, which would be this one, has the biggest zone of inhibition. This would be the strongest antibiotic for this particular bacterium. So this one works really well, this one works okay, that one works a little, and these two barely work at all. So of the 5 antibiotics that are on this disc here, this one will be the one most likely to be chosen to be prescribed to the patient. Another kind of antibiotic drug are tetracyclines. These inhibit the growth of bacteria by inhibiting protein synthesis in the cell wall. And these are used to treat a wide variety of gram-negative and gram-positive bacteria, and some other bacterial infections as well. And these are also prescribed for sexually transmitted diseases. Some examples of tetracycline antibiotics include demococycline, also known by the brand name of declamycin, doxycycline, known by the names Vibertabs and Vibermycin, minocycline, known by the names Minicin and Dinicin, and tetracycline, known by the brand name of Sumicin. Another type of antibiotic drug are the carbapenem antibiotics, and these interfere with the structure of the cell wall of the bacterium and will eventually lead to the cell death. And these are effective against some gram-negative bacteria and some gram-positive bacteria. And some examples of this kind of drug would be doripenem, known by the trade name of Dorbax, ertapenem, also known by its brand name of Invans, and meropenem, known by the trade name of Merum IV. Another type of antibiotic drug is a monobactam antibiotic. And these interfere with the structure of the cell wall of the bacterium and will eventually cause the cell death. And these are effective against gram-negative bacteria. An example of this kind of antibiotic would be aztreonam, which is known by its trade name of Azictam. Another category of antibiotics are the quinolone antibiotics. These will interfere with the bacterium's DNA and will cause cell death. And these are effective against gram-negative bacteria. An example of this category of antibiotics would be sonoxacin and nalidixic acid, which is known by its trade name of Negram. Another type of antibiotic are the fluoroquinolone antibiotic drugs. And these inhibit an enzyme that is essential to the bacterial DNA replication and will lead to the bacterium's cell death. And these are effective against gram-negative bacteria, some gram-positive bacteria, and also some other types of bacteria. And some examples of this type of antibiotics: ciprofloxacin, known by the brand name of Cipro; gemafloxacin, known by the name Factive; levofloxacin, known by the brand name of Levaquin; moxifloxacin, known by the brand name of Avelox; norfloxacin, known by Noroxin; and ofloxacin, known by the brand name of Floxin. Another type of antibiotic drugs are the macrolide and ketolide antibiotic drugs. And these can either inhibit or kill bacteria. And these interfere with the RNA and protein synthesis within the bacteria. And these are effective against some gram-negative bacteria and some gram-positive bacteria, and then anaerobic bacteria. The ketolides are effective against bacteria that are resistant to several antibiotic drugs. Some examples of this type: azithromycin, known by the brand names of Zmax and Zithromax; clarithromycin, known by the brand names of Biaxin or Biaxin XL; erythromycin, known by the trade name Eritab; and telithromycin, known by the brand name of Kedic. When it comes to antibiotic drugs, it's very common to see combination antibiotic drugs. and these will include an anti-infective and an antibiotic. And these will inhibit back-to-back steps within the bacteria that are needed for building cellular protein. And these are used against methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, or MRSA, bacterial infections of the skin. Some examples of a combination antibiotic drug would include Bactrim, which is a combination of sulfamethoxazole and trimethoprim. And drug Septa is also a combination of sulfamethoxazole and trimethoprim. Some other types of antibiotic drugs. The two drugs listed here and other drugs are used to treat gram-positive bacterial infections, in particular MRSA, such as clindamycin, known by the brand name Cleocin, and vancomycin, known by the name vancomycin. See, the bacterium Staph aureus is a gram-positive bacterium. Now, for years, this bacterium could be killed by the penicillin class of drugs. It has developed strains that were resistant to the penicillin drugs and to methicillin, which is the most common drug used in the penicillin category. So this resistant strain of bacteria is now named methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, or MRSA, MRSA. Now, MRSA causes serious and sometimes fatal infection in hospitalized patients, and now has been found in patients who are in other healthcare facilities and even at home. Now, MRSA exists in the noses of some healthcare providers who are not ill, but inadvertently pass it on to hospitalized patients whose immune systems are unable to combat it. Non-symptomatic healthcare providers with MRSA in the nose are treated with a topical drug, Bactroban, and infected hospitalized patients are treated with intravenous vancomycin or linezolid. Now, unfortunately, some strains of MRSA have now become resistant to vancomycin, and drug companies are racing to create a new antibiotic drug that can take the place of vancomycin in combating the resistant bacteria. Alright, now we'll move on to drugs that are used to treat HIV and AIDS. Now, AIDS is eventually a fatal disease, and the HIV virus will attach to the CD4 receptors on helper T lymphocytes, and this will direct the lymphocyte to produce more HIV using the lymphocyte's own DNA. And as the newly produced viruses are released, the lymphocyte is destroyed. These newly released viruses will go on to infect more helper T lymphocytes, which will further weaken the immune system. So as this cycle continues, larger numbers of helper T cells are destroyed. So that means the action of the suppressor T cells, the CD8 lymphocytes, is unopposed. So this throws off the balance of the CD4s versus the CD8 lymphocytes. So this will further suppress the immune system. And although the person's body will produce antibodies against HIV, the immune system is never able to eradicate the virus. HIV transmission, there are multiple routes for transmission. It can include contact with an infected individual. It could be contact with contaminated blood, used needles. An infected mother transmits the virus to the fetus or to a breastfeeding infant. Some historical notes about HIV and AIDS. In 1984, although there were only 3,000 reported cases of AIDS in the United States, researchers at the National Cancer Institute, including the co-discoverer of the virus, Dr. Robert Gallo, approached Burroughs Wellcome, a drug company, to develop a drug to treat AIDS. Although the other drug companies were also approached, they're concerned about working with the deadly virus, as well as apparently limited use for a drug at the time, resulted in an unenthusiastic response. Burroughs Wellcome, however, responded to the request and tested many different drugs, one of which was AZT. Now, AZT is actually a trade name, and it's also sold under the trade names Zidovudine and Retrovir. Now, this drug was originally synthesized in 1974, tested as a treatment for cancer, but it wasn't effective. And other uses for it were never investigated, so it simply just sat on the shelf. In 1986, clinical testing of AZT was begun using a double-blind study in which severely ill AIDS patients were divided in two groups. One group received AZT, while the control group received a generic placebo. Shortly after the study was begun, it was stopped when it found that those in the control group had a 40% mortality rate, while those receiving AZT only had a 6% mortality rate. In March 1988, just 4 months after the new drug application was filed, the FDA approved AZT. Burroughs Wellcome chose the generic name Zidovudine for the new AIDS drug and the trade name Retrovir. And the trade name Retrovir is a reference to the fact that AIDS belongs to the class of retroviruses. Now, originally, HIV-positive patients were not begun on any kind of drug therapy until they were symptomatic. But later, the standard treatment was to treat patients with one antiviral drug as soon as the diagnosis of HIV was made. The first study of a combined drug therapy showed that using 2 or more antiviral drugs increased a low CD4 cell count so much that the combination therapy became the standard form of treatment in 1996. Now, a person who is infected with HIV will remain without symptoms for 4 to 5 years. And at this point, there's a progressive decrease in the number of T lymphocytes. And some common symptoms of someone with HIV, fever, night sweats, weakness, diarrhea, weight loss, fatigue, and swollen glands. Now, the dividing line between diagnosis of an HIV infection and diagnosis of AIDS is determined by either the presence or absence of 2 main things. CD4 lymphocytes and opportunistic infection. If the CD4 lymphocyte count falls below 200 cells per cubic millimeter, or if opportunistic infections are present, both of these are key indicators that the disease has progressed to the point of AIDS. All right, when it comes to drug therapy for AIDS, the drugs are used to suppress the virus and also to treat any secondary opportunistic infections that will develop from the infection. Okay, drugs used to treat HIV also will inhibit the growth of the retrovirus, but they are unable to kill the virus. So the goal for this kind of therapy is to decrease the viral load, which is a reference to the total number of viruses in the blood and in lymphocytes, and also to delay the onset of AIDS and clinical complications from opportunistic infections. And the end goal for this method of treatment is to suppress HIV replication for as long as possible. The first study of a combined therapy showed that using 2 or more antiviral drugs increased the CD4 count so significantly that the combination therapy became the standard treatment in 1996, and this treatment is often called the AIDS cocktail. So several individual antiretroviral drugs are given at the same time, or the physician can prescribe a single tablet that contains 2 different antiviral drugs. And in 2006, the FDA approved the first combination drug that contained 3 different AIDS drugs, a triplet. The next generation treatment for HIV is called HAART, H-A-A-R-T, and that's an acronym for Highly Active Antiretroviral Therapy. And it uses a combination of antiretroviral drugs that target different parts of the HIV virus. A little bit more in depth on how this works. Like all viruses, HIV cannot reproduce by itself like a human cell can. It must enter a lymphocyte in the human body to be able to reproduce. Then it will inject its own genetic material, which is a single strand of viral RNA, into the DNA material of the CD4 lymphocyte. From here you have transcriptase that will copy nucleic acids and build new strands of the viral DNA, which is then integrated into the DNA of the host cell, the CD4 lymphocyte. As new viruses leave the CD4 lymphocyte, this creates holes in the cell membrane, and the lymphocyte will basically just fall apart. And there are many different kinds of drugs used to treat HIV and AIDS. The first kind we'll talk about, nucleoside reverse transcriptase inhibitor drugs. And these will inhibit the enzyme reverse transcriptase. And this is an enzyme that the virus needs to reproduce itself. The inhibitor drugs also become a part of the viral DNA chain, which causes it to break, and then the virus will die. Some examples of this type of drug, abacavir, also known by the trade name Zymogen, didanisine, also known by its trade name Videx, emtricitabine, also known by its trade name Emtreva, lamivudine, also known by the trade name Epivir, stavudine, also known by the trade name Zerit, and of course the drug we mentioned already, zidovudine, more commonly known by the trade name Retrovir. Now, patients being treated with Retrovir can have a side effect of having a low white blood cell count, and the antipsychotic drug lithium can be given to these patients because it has a known side effect of causing a high white blood cell count. Another type of drug used to treat HIV and AIDS are nucleotide analog reverse transcriptase inhibitors. Now, these act in the same way as nucleoside reverse transcriptase inhibitors, but in a slightly modified molecular structure. And these will stop the retrovirus from reproducing. And this type of drug is given orally, and an example of this kind of drug would be tenofovir, also known by the brand name of Viriad. Another type of drug used to treat HIV and AIDS are non-nucleoside reverse transcriptase inhibitors. And these will bind directly to reverse transcriptase. This is an enzyme that is necessary to reproduce viral DNA. So it will disrupt the activity of the enzyme, and therefore the virus will die. Some examples of this type of drug would include delaverdine, also known by the trade name Rescriptor, efavirenz, known by the trade name Sestiva, etrovirine, known by the brand name of Intellence, nevirapine, known by the trade name of Viramune, rilpiravine, also known by the brand name of Edurant. Another type of drug could be used are protease inhibitors, and these will inhibit the viral enzyme protease. And protease is the enzyme that will normally break down proteins in the virus to help reassemble the virus before it can be released from the host cell. So this is an important last step that must happen before the virus can be fully reproduced. So without protease being available to function properly, the virus can't replicate, and then the virus will die. Some examples of protease inhibitors include atazanavir, also known by the brand name of Reataz, darunavir, known by the brand name of Prozista, fosamprenavir, known by the trade name of Lexiva, indinavir, known by the trade name of Crixivan. Some other examples of protease inhibitors, nelfinavir, known by the name Viracept, rotanavir, known by the brand name of Novir, sequinavir, known by the brand names of Inverase and Fortivase, and tipranavir, known by its trade name Aptevis. Another kind of drug that's used to treat HIV and AIDS are fusion inhibitor drugs. And these will act by blocking HIV when it tries to fuse its viral membrane to the cell membrane of the CD4 lymphocyte. Because the virus can't fuse with the lymphocyte, it can't inject genetic material into the cell and take that cell over. So if this step doesn't happen, then the virus can't replicate. Then it will eventually die without a host cell. An example of this kind of drug would be Infuvertide, also known by a trade name Fusion. So another type of drug used to treat HIV and AIDS are integrase inhibitors. And these kinds of drugs are also known as integrase strand transfer inhibitor drugs. And without the enzyme integrase, the retroviral DNA, the strand is complete, but it can't take over and direct the cellular activities of the CD4 lymphocyte. So if they can't take over the cell, it can't finish reproducing itself, and then eventually will die. And some examples of this kind of drug would be dolutegravir, also known by the brand name Tivicay, and raltegravir, known by its trade name Icentris. So another kind of drug used to treat HIV and AIDS are cellular chemokine receptor antagonist drugs. And these act by binding to and then blocking cellular chemokine receptors on a CD4 lymphocyte. An example of this kind of drug is Maraviroc, also known by the trade name of Celsentry. You can also have multiple combination drugs that are used to treat HIV and AIDS, such as Atripla, which is a combination of efavirenz, emtricitabine, and tenofovir; Comavir, which is a combination of lamivudine and cidovudine; Epsicom, which is a combination of abacavir and lamivudine; Kaletra, which is a combination of lopinavir and ritonavir; Trazavir, which is a combination of abacavir, lamivudine, and cidovudine; Stribild, which is a combination of elvitegravir, cobicostat, emtricitabine, tenofovir; and Truvada, which is a combination of emtricitabine and tenofovir. Now we'll mention a drug alert about two of these combination drugs. Kaletra is a combination drug that contains two protease inhibitor drugs. Now this drug can cause life-threatening reactions if it's taken with these other drugs listed: rifampin, St. John's wort, Zocor, Halcyon, phenobarbital, or dexamethasone. Stribild is also known as a quad pill because it contains 4 different drugs. And one of the drugs, cobicostat, is not an antiviral drug. Instead, it's there to prolong the action of the antiretroviral drugs by inhibiting enzymes in the liver that would normally inactivate and metabolize elvitegravir. Now we'll talk about drugs used to treat conditions that are related to HIV and AIDS. Now these uncommon diseases have an unusual opportunity to attack the compromised immune system of patients with HIV. So they're known as opportunistic infections. So HIV patients are prone to developing rare cancers such as Kaposi sarcoma and Burkitt's lymphoma. Another condition is AIDS wasting syndrome, which is characterized by weight loss and a loss of muscle mass. The first condition we'll talk about, cytomegalovirus retinitis, or CMV. Now this condition, quite common. Most people are exposed to this at some point in their life, and it's usually not that big a deal. It's usually only a big deal when people contract it when they already have a compromised immune system, like those patients with HIV. And the drugs that are listed here are used to prevent CMV infections in AIDS patients and also patients with organ transplants. And examples of these kind of drugs would include cidofovir, known by the brand name Vistide; foscarnet; ganciclovir, also known by its trade name Cytovine; and valganciclovir, known by its trade name Valcyte. Another condition that's related to HIV infection is actually a complex of 2 infections, and collectively it's known as Mycobacterium avium intracellular complex, or MAC. This is a common late-stage complication of AIDS, and this occurs in about 40% of AIDS patients. And this is caused by 2 very closely related bacterium, Mycobacterium avium and Mycobacterium intracellular. And these 2 are so similar it's difficult to differentiate between the 2. So that's why these are usually grouped together as one complex infection, MAC. And this infection will infect the intestines and other organs in the body. The drugs used to treat a MAC infection include anti-tuberculosis drugs, macrolide antibiotics, fluoroquinolone antibiotics, aminoglycoside antibiotics, and orphan drugs. And some of these drugs can also include amikacin, known by the trade name Amikin; azithromycin, known by its trade name Zithromax; erythromycin, known by the name Biaxin; and rifabutin, known by its trade name Mycobutin. Another condition that's opportunistic for patients with HIV, pneumocystis jirovecii pneumonia. This condition is formerly known as pneumocystitis carinii pneumonia, or PCP. Now this is the most serious infection and complication of AIDS, and this will eventually affect about 3/4 of all AIDS patients. Now this is a fungus that is incredibly common in the environment. and for most people is never a concern at all. Very rare that it causes any kind of issue for the average healthy person. But with patients with AIDS, this can lead to a very life-threatening situation. Some drugs that would be used to treat the kind of fungal infection: atovaquone, known by the brand name Mepron; pentamidine, known by the trade names Nubupent and Pentam 300. You can also use combination drugs to treat this condition, like Bactrim and Septra, and both of which are combinations of sulfamethoxazole and trimethoprim. Alright, drugs are used to treat the condition of AIDS wasting syndrome. Now, these drugs are used to stimulate the appetite of AIDS patients and to build muscle mass and to treat the extreme weight loss of AIDS. And some drugs that would be used for this kind of condition: dronabinol, known by the trade name Marinol; megestrol, known by its trade name Megace; oxandrolone, known by its trade name Oxandrin; oxymethylone, known by its trade name Andadrol 50; somatropin, known by its trade names Biotropin Serostim. I now talk about drugs used to treat other viral infections. Now, antiviral drugs are used to prevent and treat infections caused by influenza virus, hepatitis virus, and others. When it comes to drugs for the influenza virus infection, these are antiviral drugs used to prevent or treat influenza A or influenza B infections. And some of these could include amantadine, known by the trade name Simitrel; the influenza virus vaccine, known as Fluarix or Flumist; oseltamivir, known by the Tamiflu; rimantadine, known by the brand name of Flumidine; and zanamivir, known by its trade name of Relenza. Now, flu shots are given prophylactically to prevent influenza, and these vaccines can either be the whole virus or a part of the virus, or a surface antigen from the virus to provoke the body's immune response and to create a temporary immunity. Now, annual revaccination is necessary to provide protection against the most current strains of the two most common and dangerous flu families, influenza A and influenza B. So each February, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention selects those strains of influenza that are the most prevalent in Asia and other parts of the world to include in the flu vaccine that will be offered in the United States the following fall before the start of flu season. Flu viruses mutate constantly and create many new subtypes, and so the influenza vaccine must be reformulated every year. Persons who get the flu shot can still get the flu from other strains of the virus that are not included in the flu vaccine. Drugs for hepatitis virus infection. These are for treating chronic hepatitis A, hepatitis B, or hepatitis C. And some examples of this kind of drug would include adefovir, known by its trade name Hepzira; entecavir, known by its trade name Barclude; interferon alpha 2b, otherwise known as Intron A; interferon alpha-con 1, also known by the trade name Infergen; and lamivudine, known by the trade name Epivir; peginterferon alpha 2a, known by the trade name of Pegasus; peginterferon alpha 2b, known as Pegintron; ribavirin, known by the trade names of Rebitol and Copaegis; telbivudine, known by the trade names of Tizeca; and tenofovir, known by the brand name of Viriad. You can also treat hepatitis virus infection with vaccines, such as the hepatitis A vaccine, known by the trade names of Havrix and Vacta; the hepatitis B vaccine, also known as Recombavax HB and Gerix B; and Twinrix, which is a combination vaccine of hepatitis A and hepatitis B vaccines. Another way to treat hepatitis virus infections is with a hepatitis B immunoglobulin, also known by the name Hepagam B. This is used to prevent hepatitis B from developing after an initial exposure, before that patient has time to develop their own antibodies. Some various drugs for herpes virus infection, whether it be type 1 or type 2, herpes zoster, or HPV, human papillomavirus. Alright, now we talk about drugs that are used to treat fungal and yeast infections. Now, both fungi and yeast can cause disease either topically or systemically. Many of these are going to be opportunistic organisms, and these will grow most successfully when the patient's immune system is already compromised or under stress. For opportunistic organisms, in patients that are immunocompromised, such as patients with cancer undergoing chemotherapy, AIDS, bone marrow transplants, so on, infections can become widespread and extremely serious. And fungi and yeast can be treated with the same antifungal or anti-yeast drugs because they are so biologically similar to one another. Antifungal drugs will act by binding to a specific receptor on the cell membrane of the fungus or the yeast. This will change the permeability of the membrane, which will cause the cell to basically fall apart and the contents will leak out. Another way you can treat fungal infections is with topical drugs. These will be used on infections on the skin caused by the fungus tinea, such as for ringworm, athlete's foot and jock itch. This can also be used on fungal infections of the nails, such as in onychomycosis, but only up until the infection reaches the nail bed. Drugs for systemic fungal infections. So when fungal infections become embedded into the nail bed and the nail becomes misshapen or thickened or discolored, then you can't use a topical treatment. You must use a systemic treatment. So these must be treated with an oral antifungal drug that will act systemically through the blood to reach the tissues around the nail. And drugs used to treat systemic fungal infections can be given with an oral route of administration or an intravenous route. And these are used to treat severe fungal infections in other parts of the body, such as aspergillosis, blastomycosis, cryptococcus, and histoplasmosis. And some examples of this kind of drug would include amphotericin B, known by the trade name of Fungazone, caspofungin, known by its trade name Cancetus, fluconazole, also known by the trade name Diflucan, flucytazine, known by the trade names Ancabon, griseofulvin, known by its trade name Grifulin. Some other examples of drugs used to treat systemic fungal infections: itraconazole, known by its trade name Sporanox, ketoconazole, known by its trade name Nizoral, posaconazole, known by its trade name Noxafil, terbinafine, known by the trade name Lamisil, and voriconazole, known by the trade name of Vfend. Alright, now we'll talk about conditions that are caused by yeast infection. Now, topical yeast infections can occur in the mouth, and drugs that treat yeast infections can either be given orally or intravenously. Now, drugs that will treat yeast infections act systemically to treat severe infections, such as candidiasis, that's found in the mouth that extend into the esophagus and into the stomach and other parts of the body. And many are also used to treat systemic yeast infections. Some examples of this kind of drug would include amphotericin B, known by the brand name of Fungazone, nidulafungin, known by the brand name of Araxis, caspofungin, known by the name Cancetus, fluconazole, known by the brand name Diflucan, flucytazine, known by the name of Ancabon, itraconazole, known as Sporanax, ketoconazole, known as Nizoral, mycofungin, known by the name Mycamine, posaconazole, known by the name Noxafil, voriconazole, known by the trade name of Vfend. Alright, that brings us to the end of this chapter. We will continue our video series on pharmacology with our next video on chapter number 22, chemotherapy drugs.